Probably one of the most controversial US presidential deaths that most historians do not consider to have been caused by an assassination was that of Franklin Roosevelt. It happened in Warm Springs, Georgia on April the 12th, 1945. President Roosevelt was 63 years old. Well, we all know at least some parts of his medical history. His basic disease was poliomyelitis, or just polio, although certain medical doctors nowadays believe that it was some other disease. You can consult, for example, Dr. Zebra's website on the US presidential health and medical histories from Washington to Obama. Roosevelt had been a lean, athletic man involved in various strenuous activities, as incidentally his cousin Theodore Roosevelt, who also was one of his predecessors and ironically a Republican, while Franklin was a Democrat. Sometime in the summer of 1921, he had ingested unknowingly the virus that would result shockingly quickly in just 2 days, 2 or 3 days, in his paralysis from the waist down at his summertime home in New Brunswick, eastern Canada. He had to finally be transported from there to New York City. For the first 2 weeks of his paralysis, he had been unable to pass urine, and then he was fitted with a catheter to help him to urinate. During the last over 23 years of his life, he strenuously, through vigorous physical therapy, taught himself to walk short distances with the help of crutches or a cane by swiveling his torso forward. This looked laborious, and back then most members of the press corps were so deferential to the president that very few photographs exist of the laborious process whereby he had to be helped out of the car, and then he had to be helped to walk short distances to the podium or to a building. And what usually happened was that not only did he wear leg braces to keep his withering legs in place and to give him some firmness at the podium, but also he normally leaned on an able-bodied person's arm, often or usually that of one of his sons, I think James Roosevelt. Despite this physical disability, he went on to become one of the United States and probably also of the Western democratic countries' most successful, and most notable political leaders. Although he, of course, alone cannot be credited for ending the Great Depression, he anyway was able to mitigate it by launching massive public works projects in the United States, by increasing the economic intervention by the US federal government and Congress, where for most of his presidency the Democrats had a clear majority. It wasn't until the last 4 years or so of his presidency when they had clearly slimmer majorities, although the process of their slimming down had begun in January 1939 when the US Congress assembled following the midterm elections of November 1938, and the Democrats already had clearly slimmer clearly smaller majorities than they had from 1933 until 1938, but they still were clearly in the majority. Of course, the Second World War increased his stress levels despite his famous smile and optimism. He really wanted to make Americans believe that not only would they overcome the last effects of the Great Depression, but they would also help the other democracies win the Second World War. By about 1940, it was clear that President Roosevelt's health was failing. His blood pressure started to increase in a notable way. Unfortunately, according to Dr. Zebra, an apparently American medical doctor who has for several or many years maintained a website dedicated to the examination, at least in a shorthand form of the health and medical histories of US presidents from Washington to Obama. Anyway, the medical doctors back in the 1940s still did not understand that rising blood pressure is a serious symptom of some other medical problem or problems, such as the hardening of arteries or arteriosclerosis and heart disease. And it can also be a symptom preceding the onset of some forms of diabetes, as an aside. It didn't help matters, and actually one of the reasons for his rising blood pressure was the fact that regularly, for decades, he smoked over a pack of cigarettes per day. It wouldn't be until the 1950s and 1960s that the adverse health effects of smoking would be established beyond a reasonable doubt. His diet may not have been one of the healthiest either. It may have been too high in fats, although this is just my conjecture. Anyway, by the time he had to decide whether to seek a record fourth term in 1944, it was clear that President Roosevelt would do so at risk, at his own risk for his health and possibly even for his life. In March 1944, just over a year before he died, according to Dr. Zebra, he suffered so severe chest pains that his doctor had to be called in, and he diagnosed the already ailing president with congestive heart failure. He then prescribed Digitalis or Digitalis, a popular heart medicine of that time, and Roosevelt would continue to use it for the rest of his life. Although Roosevelt was clearly in a bad condition by the time the Democratic National Convention met in probably July 1944, he was renominated by a clear, if not an overwhelming majority, and then he decided for the second time to change his vice presidential candidate, this time from the left-wing Democrat Henry Wallace to the more centrist Democrat and fellow New Dealer Senator Harry Truman of Missouri. Truman noted that in their first official lunch together, the president's hands shook so badly that he accidentally poured more cream into his saucer than into his coffee cup. Despite being in clearly failing health with heart disease and high blood pressure and also sleep apnea, he would unexpectedly fall asleep during conversations, and even once while signing his name. leaving an unreadable scrawl. He risked his health, already fragile health, by campaigning in bad weather, in cold and rainy weather. Besides, President Roosevelt even advised or ordered his official medical doctor to claim that the president was supposedly in excellent health, even though, according to Dr. Zebra, even non-medical people could clearly see during Roosevelt's last months that he was a severely sick and aging man. Well, Roosevelt was able to get re-elected to a fourth term as US President in early November 1944, although his popular vote percentage was the lowest of his 4 presidential victories, only 53%, compared to 57% in 1932, 60% in 1936, and 55% in 1940. After he had safely been re-elected, he then finalized his last will and testament and made arrangements for his funeral. If he had expected to live at least some or several more years, let alone many more years, he hardly would have taken those steps. Besides, in January 1945, he ordered all of his 13 grandchildren to attend his inauguration, the last presidential inauguration he would have, as it turned out. Besides, the inaugural ceremonies were very plain. Instead of riding to the Capitol Hill, where the US Congress meets, he delivered his brief inaugural address lasting under 10 minutes from one wing or balcony of the White House and canceled the inaugural parade. Finally, and then in February 1945, despite his health problems, he attended the Yalta Conference in what was then the southern part of the Soviet Union with the Soviet dictator Joseph or Joseph Stalin and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and their top advisors. On March the 1st, 1945, he gave his last public speech in the United States House of Representatives to a joint session of the US Congress. And for the first time, he gave that speech to the Congress sitting. He drove there or rode there in a simple kitchen chair or wheelchair that he himself had designed, probably already in the 1920s. He apologized for his decision to sit down in such a careless and funny sounding way that many, if not most, members of Congress were not alarmed by that position of the president. It is a whole lot easier to give a speech sitting down than standing up carrying 10 pounds of steel on my legs. That was his reference to his leg braces. He had lost since maybe the spring of maybe March or April 1944, or even June, already until the election in November 1944, over 20 pounds, and he would continue still to lose weight. Indeed, I remember from reading the 2-volume presidential memoirs of Harry Truman, from the first volume, that Mrs. Roosevelt had complained to him after the November 1944 US presidential elections that the president simply refused to eat. He had lost his appetite, and that of course was an alarming sign, because until then he had had a good appetite. So 4 weeks later, on March the 29th, 1945, he left Washington, D.C. for Warm Springs in Georgia. He planned to rest there and to do quiet written work and to prepare for the United Nations opening session. For much, if not most, of those 2 weeks, his health seemed to improve somewhat. His face developed a healthier color. He ate well, and he seemed to be in good spirits. However, there were times when he looked clearly tired, old, and sickly. I think one of those times was 1 or 2 days before he died. He was last photographed on the day before he died, that is on April the 11th, 1945. He did not look especially sickly or fatally sickly, but clearly aged and notably thin. And then in the early afternoon of April the 12th, 1945, he was sitting in for a portrait that would turn out to be then unfinished, when suddenly he pressed his other hand on his forehead and on his temple, complaining or murmuring, "I have a terrific headache." Moments later, he slumped in his wheelchair. 2 servants then rushed in and carried him to his bedroom and then dressed him in his pajamas. But sometime later that afternoon, President Roosevelt died. The official cause of death was cerebral or brain hemorrhage. And given the fact that his arteries were severely sclerotic at the time of his death, so sclerotic that when his body was embalmed, the embalmers had great difficulty sticking a pin to his veins or something like that. And given the fact that he had already an advanced case of heart disease, and that he continued to smoke despite his health problems, and that in the last months of his life even non-doctors, non-medical personnel had been shocked by his thin and aged and sickly appearance, it is very likely that President Roosevelt died of natural causes. There is a technical and theoretical possibility that someone hostile to him hastened his death by administering poison to him in a supposed healthy drink. Some or several years ago, such a theory was even published in one article of the long-time Canadian weekly magazine Maclean's. So we cannot count even this possibility out, although once again the burden of proof clearly lies on the side of those who claim that he was assassinated because he had sufficiently severe medical conditions to die purely of natural causes. And we, of course, should note the wartime stress and also the fact that he had just weeks before his death become angry at the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, who clearly was establishing his own hegemony in Eastern Europe despite supposedly having promised to respect the right of Eastern European countries to decide freely and fairly through elections what kinds of political systems they would like to have.